You'll find the chamber legislative priorities at your seat, both the federal and the state priorities. We made a trip to D.C. last fall. Our trip to Tallahassee was in March, and we will have yet another trip to D.C. this fall. Among the major priorities were transportation funding and acceleration of transportation funding, both in Tallahassee and D.C., specifically in the South County area around University Parkway and I-75. Economic and international development funding is always a priority, reducing the sales tax on commercial leases, and restoring PICO funds for our educational institutions. Another big one at both the federal and state level was the flood insurance affordability and changes made to the Biggert-Waters Act, which again, I think we were fairly happy with the results there. Legislators, a job well done this year on business issues. Excuse me. I want to go ahead and introduce our legislators, and each of them are going to have 8 minutes to discuss their thoughts on this year's session. We will have a Q&A session after each of them speaks, and I think the operating rules are at your table, but we'll go over those also when we get there. First to the podium in Neil Spiritus selected order is Representative Jim Boyd.
Thank you. Normally I don't get, thank you. Normally Greg and I don't get to go before the senator, so this is a privilege. Thanks, Neil. I'll pay you a little bit later. All of us are going to take credit for the good things that happened this session, so I'll get to go first and take as much credit as I can. But as I've told you before, we've got a great delegation, and it's a real honor to work with these gentlemen and the senator from Tampa, Arthenia Joyner, in doing the right things for our community and the state of Florida. So it is a privilege, but we've got a great delegation. And as you know, we talked about it last time with Senator Galvano now in the Senate and his clout and his presence over there. It just makes things so much easier and so much more fun to get things done together. So that's a privilege as well. I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that I think that we did. I know some of this will be redundant perhaps, so I'll try not to cover anybody else's comments up. But as you know, we passed the $77 billion budget. We've talked before about our first couple of years up there, at least Representative Stubbe and mine, with deficits that we had to cover. So it is kind of nice operating in a budget environment where there's a little extra money. But the problem of that is everybody thinks that everything they've got ought to be funded. And a lot of it should be, but obviously we can't do everything. So we tried this year to be as judicious as we could be while doing some good things for Manatee County and Sarasota County here. So some of that, as you know, education, and I'll let the senator speak to that because that's kind of his main area of responsibility in the Senate with appropriations. The highest funding ever in the history of Florida, which I think is incredible. It's good for business, it's good for families, it's just good for Florida. So very excited about that. We also had some local things that were done. We were able to get some money for water projects at Manatee County, some beach renourishment money. Alzheimer's research got some money, STEM program at USF, which I'm very excited about. Manatee Community College is, finally going to at least get a good start on that new library that they've needed forever. And all this, I guess, I should throw the caveat out, is contingent on the governor's approval because he can go through and look at different line items in there. But so I would tell you, if you have an area that's of interest to you, I know we're advocating, those of us up here, for what's we think is important, but if you have an area that's of interest to you or your organization or whatever that's in the budget, I wouldn't stop the phone calls. I would keep cards and letters and phone calls going to the governor's office to advocate for those things that you think are important. On a couple of things that I worked on this year, I did half a dozen bills, maybe 3 or 4 were somewhat innocuous and just little fixes for different groups that are important, but a couple of things that I think were important for Florida and for business. One was, and I think I talked about it at the last meeting, the Department of Revenue found a way to tax internet reservations, like for hotels and restaurants and the like. and through the communication services tax, they were taxing or sending out tax notices on those transactions. An example I use, a Marriott in Orlando got like a $140,000 bill. And when they sent their lawyers and their accountants to Tallahassee to say this isn't right, we shouldn't have to pay it, Department of Revenue kind of backed it down to, I think the number was $2,400, just kind of trying to settle. So they knew they didn't really probably have much of a leg to stand on. And in fact, in the end, there was like a little over 80 different audits of that sort, and they vacated the audits, but we were afraid that at any time, different administrations or whatever might come back in and try to tax it again. So we ran a bill that fixed that problem, so no longer, it clarified actually that you can't tax those internet transactions. The communication services tax was not set up for that. The analogy I use would be, it's like you're taxing the hose, and now you want to tax the water that goes through the hose, which wasn't what that was set up to do. So hopefully that fixes that problem. One of the other things that I worked on that I'm very happy about with the Commissioner of Agriculture, Adam Putnam, and Senator Brandes in the Senate was a charities bill. And you may have read a little bit about or heard, but you know, we all know the stories over the past several years of some of these rogue charities coming in and you know, taking money from unsuspecting contributors that are generous with their hard-earned money, and paying some of these charities 95 to 98% was going in their pockets, and very small percentage going to the charity itself. So anyway, what we did was put some real strength in the law. There's a website that's being created that you can go on and look at, the Commissioner's office will manage, that you can go on and look at any charity you want to contribute to, see how much they're getting, see where their money's going, who's getting it, and that kind of thing. And also there's a lot more accountability in the law with some financial reporting and the like. So the major charities across the state banded with us and supported it. We had a few that didn't like it, and obviously you can probably guess who those might be, but that I think is a good thing, and it's a good thing for Florida. You know, we've got a huge state with a lot of generous people, and this will hopefully just give some certainty and some accountability to that process. Some of the other things that I know the commissioners here from the beach, the vacation rental issue, as you know, was a big deal before session. We talked about it at the last deal. With all due respect to my friends at the Braden Herald, I read an article yesterday that suggested that the major problem was still not fixed. We believe it is. The only thing that communities can't do now as a result of the legislation that was passed is they can never tell you can't rent a property, and they can't tell you for how long. But they can regulate them, they can zone them, they can they can manage them. And Representative Stubbe may speak to that a little more, because being a legal expert and it came through his committee, he I think has a little more in depth on that. But we think that was a good fix. It was very close to not making it, and if it didn't make it, then we would have the law the way it is right now, or the way it is right now. So that wouldn't have fixed the problem. So we think we fixed it, and we hope so. So that was good, I believe. Some of the other quickly, the flood insurance. Greg mentioned the federal program. Senator Brandes in the Senate and the House member ran a bill that allows a private market to come into the flood business under certain guidelines and restrictions from the Department of Financial Services. I'm hoping that'll open up some market opportunity for carriers to come in and want to write flood insurance and be another resource for homeowners in the big picture of flood insurance and how important that is to us. So that made it through. Then as far as the rest, we'll be happy to answer questions as we go along, but kind of that was the big picture for me. I think it was a very successful session. Everybody worked really hard. I think we got a lot done. I'm not patting ourselves on the back because we're your representatives, but I really feel good about the session. I think everybody I've talked to felt pretty good about it, and hopefully we did a lot of good, and that will start to pan out over the next several months as bills get signed into law and that process begins. So anyway, it is a privilege to represent this community. It's an honor, and we take it very seriously. But I can tell you, as I told a few people this morning, it's great to be home. It's a grind, and everybody's busy, and I get back here, and it's almost like, wow, I got a lot of free time on my hands, so people at my office get a little nervous. But it's a great privilege, really, to represent Manatee County and Sarasota County in my case, and I'm happy to answer any questions a little bit later. All right, thank you.
Next, Representative Greg Stubbe.
Thanks, Greg. Representative Boyd hit a lot of the kind of high points, so what I'd like to do is kind of go through some of the legislation that I carried, what made it through the process, what didn't make it through the process, and then I'd love to hear your questions and whatever questions you specifically have on all the issues that we dealt with this year. For 2 years I worked on, and I've talked to this group about this issue, the E911 issue, the taxing of the 911 communication services that actually pays for 911 services in our state. Believe it or not, that actually passed this year, thank God, after 2 years of working and getting the governor's office in a place where they felt comfortable with the legislation. It'll move from the 50 cents tax to 40 cents. The implementation period of that law will be in January, so the law will take effect January 2015. And then the board, the 911 board, will have the opportunity in June or July of 2015 to go and look at that fee and see if that's an appropriate amount of fee to be charged. So just give you a little bit of background. Previously, only landline and your post-pay cell phone providers were paying that 50 cents per month charge to pay for our 911 communication services, and the prepaid folks were not paying that. So if you went and bought a prepaid phone from Walmart or Target, you weren't paying that tax, or if you went to, say, Metro PCS and bought a phone and then paid prepay, so you just bought 500 minutes, you weren't paying that 50 cents fee. So this bill made it fair across the board that everybody had to pay that fee, put an implementation language in there for the retailers, and we got that across the finish line this year, so I was happy that our public service, our 911 communication services are going to be fully funded to be able to provide the type of next generation E911 that we need in our state, like texting 911 and the video capabilities that we have on our phones. I also prime co-sponsored with Representative Grant the license to carry a concealed firearm bill that basically all it did was allow our local tax collectors the opportunity to be able to take your concealed carry permit. For example, recently my wife got her concealed carry permit. She had to drive all the way down to Port Charlotte, Punta Gorda. So people in the region had to drive all the way down to a regional Department of Ag office. Now each county, if they choose to take advantage of this, will have the opportunity to just submit the paperwork at each one of their county offices. It was a very supported bill throughout the process, and I think it'll make going through that process a lot simpler for folks in the state. I also carried a family law bill, which ended up becoming a lot more public than I thought it ever would. For 2 years, I've also worked on legislation as it relates to judicial notice in emergency family law cases. And I'll give you a quick example for the non-lawyers in the room. Prior to now, after this bill passed, and hopefully the governor's office has said they will sign it, prior to now, if you had an emergency family law situation, you could not take judicial notice, and Judge Smith knows what all this means, but you could not take judicial notice of, say, a domestic violence injunction. You had to have a hearing, and you had to give notice of that. So this bill would allow, in those emergency type situations where they don't have time to do the notice, and there's bodily injury or harm that may happen to one of the individuals, they now can take judicial notice of court orders to be able to protect the participants in that. That was part of the bill. The other part of the bill had a little bit of, the case was DOR versus Daly. It addressed language as it related to time sharing, and when you do an up or down modification of child support, being able to take into account what the parties have been doing as far as a time sharing arrangement. That was the bill, passed the House unanimously last year, went to the Senate, and then the Senate, there was an amendment that was put on to allow an illegal immigrant who has been present in our state since he was 9, the ability to practice law. So suddenly a very innocuous bill became a very public and very publicized bill. And I spent a lot of time really thinking about, because I voted against, both Representative Boyd and I voted against the illegal tuition bill this year. And I spent a lot of time researching that issue. So just to give you a little bit of background that maybe you didn't get in the paper, the individual was 9 years old when he was brought to this country. And he was brought to this country by his parents who was on a valid visa. His parents overstayed that visa. And so when you overstay a visa, now you're technically unlawfully present, as the federal government would put it. So he's now unlawfully present in the United States. His parents are actually back in Mexico. He grew up, went to our public schools. He went to undergrad right here, actually in New College, believe it or not. And then he went to Florida State University where he got a law degree. Went through the process, took the bar exam, and the bar didn't know whether they could admit him or not. They posed the question to the Florida Supreme Court. The Florida Supreme Court came back and said, we would admit this individual, but we feel like we need legislative authority to do that. So hence the amendment that was put onto my bill. One of the first questions I had, and a lot of people have, is why hasn't this individual applied to be a citizen of our country? Well, he can't. He's lawfully prohibited from applying because he was brought here and his parents overstayed the visa. So even if he wanted to apply and be a citizen, he would have to move back to Mexico, stay in Mexico for 10 years, then reapply, be sponsored to be reapplied as a citizen, and then go through that process. So when I started to analyze the law, if you look at 455.10, Florida Statute 455.10 states that you can practice any occupation or business in the state of Florida regardless of your immigration status. So doctors, CPAs, agricultural individuals, insurance agents, whatever your profession is in the state of Florida, if you're regulated by the Department of Business and Professional Regulations, you can do that profession regardless of your immigration status. So after I found that out, I did a little bit more research. Florida Statute 454 actually gives the authority to admit lawyers in our state specifically to the Florida Supreme Court. We as a legislature said, you, Florida Supreme Court, are the one that's going to be able to decide who can practice law and who can't practice law in our state. And then there was an opinion on this specific case that said, we, the Florida Supreme Court, would admit this guy, but we don't feel like we have legislative authority to do it. So that amendment was tacked on to the Senate. It came to the House. I spent a lot of time researching and deliberating on that issue and decided to make it a little bit more narrower. The Senate language had said that if you were brought to this country and you resided in Florida for 10 years and you passed the bar, you could be admitted into the bar. I added 3 more elements to that. I added that you had to have work authorization in the United States. So this individual is legally authorized to work in our country pursuant to our federal government in the Immigration and Naturalization Services. That you had to have registered for selective service, that you had to have issued a Social Security card and pay taxes. Well, believe it or not, he's done all those things, and he has all those things. So I put that amendment to make it a little bit more narrow on. We put that on in the House, and we sent it over to the Senate, and the Senate passed it out. So that was one of the things that in this process, you have a bill that's moving along, and then something not related at all to the bill gets tacked on, and you're dealing with an issue that you didn't think you'd have to deal with. But I think we did what was right in that circumstance. If you know all the background and the factors in the law and you really do the research, it didn't make sense for him not to be able to practice when anybody else in our state can practice any occupation that you want, regardless of your immigration status. Let me talk about some of the things that didn't quite make it through the finish line, and if I'm going too long, just jerk my sleeve over here. You probably heard a lot about my school safety bill in the papers. I want to kind of describe to you what the bill actually did, because there was a lot of the both printed media and the news that completely, in my opinion, misrepresented what the bill actually did. What the bill does, and it passed the House with bipartisan support. Every committee, a Democrat voted for it, and on the floor, Democrats voted for this bill. It was supported by the Florida School Boards Association supported it, the Florida School Administrators Association supported it, and the Florida Sheriff's Association supported it. And what it would have done is allowed an individual who is either former or current law enforcement, former or current military, in good standing of both, who went through a school safety training program designed by the Criminal Justice Standards Training Commission, which is the same training commission that develops our school resource officer training. If there are those people, they go through that training, then the schools may designate the individual to carry a concealed firearm during their time of employment at the school. It's completely 100% optional to the school boards. So if Broward County didn't want to do it, which they didn't, they wouldn't have to, because they've got a school resource officer in every one of their schools. As I've told this group before, in Manatee County, we don't have a school resource officer in every one of our schools. In fact, every single one of our elementary schools lacks a school resource officer in our schools. And if you look at the research, in 2002, the Department of Education and the Secret Service did a research specifically on school safety, and there were 3 major findings of that report. The first was that most school shootings were resolved by someone other than law enforcement. The majority of them were resolved not by law enforcement, but by somebody else that was responding to the incident. The other interesting point was that the majority of these instances occurred in less than 15 minutes. The other interesting point, and Sandy Hook is a great example factually of this, is a quarter of these events happened in less than 6 minutes. At Sandy Hook, that individual entered that school, killed 20 people, 20 students, 6 administrators, and killed himself before police even got to the building. It was 4 minutes after that individual committed suicide before police even entered the building. In Manatee and Sarasota County, you know what the average response time is for law enforcement? And believe me, I have a lot of respect for our law enforcement in our county. Just go ahead and say that because Dad's not here. But they can't be everywhere. We can't expect our law enforcement to be everywhere where something happens. The average response for law enforcement in Manatee County is 6 to 11 minutes. So now, given the facts that I just gave you, we don't have a single school resource officer in any of our elementary schools, and most of these things occur in less than 6 minutes. What do you think is going to occur if somebody walks into one of our schools in less than 6 minutes? He has 6 to 11 minutes to do whatever he wants to do in that school. And I just don't think that's right. I think we need to ensure that our kids are safe. And so that's why I've done this bill. It passed the House. Unfortunately, there was a chairman in the Senate that didn't want to hear the bill. So I will be doing this next year, and what I plan on doing next year is coupling it with some funding in hopes that we can balance the two. We can provide some state funding specifically for school resource officers and allow this statute to pass, so if school districts want to take advantage of something like this, then we can. And I talk to a lot of school resource officers about this. Even if there's a school resource officer there, like if you look at Columbine, the shooters waited for the SROs to go to lunch. They sat outside, they watched their patrol car leave to go to lunch, and then they went into the building. So even if you have SROs there, I can guarantee you, from having a military background and an infantry background, you don't want to be the only guy responding to that. So if you had people there that are retired New York police officers, that are retired Secret Service agents, that are retired in our county, one of our JROTC commanders, the assistant commander, is a retired Army Special Forces weapons specialist. What better person to have to back up that SRO if, God forbid, something were to happen on that campus? So why don't we want to give school districts their decision to decide whether they want to take advantage of this statute or not? So I think it makes a lot of sense, and it was supported very, very much in the House, and we'll move forward. Am I getting the signal? Yeah. Okay. Well, when we get into questions, I would like to talk about a lot of the healthcare-related stuff that went on this session, because not too much of it made it through the process, but there was a lot of work on the healthcare-related front as it related to trauma care, which I know is important to Blake. So thank you very much for having us. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Next, Senator Bill Galvano.
Good morning. Like Jim and Greg, I'm very pleased to be home. Glad to be out of that building. It gets crazy, especially towards the end. The last 2 weeks, you're going in at 7 in the morning, you're there till like 1, sometimes 2 in the morning. You're getting out, you haven't seen the sunlight, and it's almost like you have some post-traumatic stress disorder once you get back to the district and then start reacclimating. I also believe we have a great delegation, Jim. We really do. You all are very well represented. People are respected on your delegation. I'm sorry Senator Joyner is not here, but for those of you who don't know, she is the incoming minority leader in the Senate, which is very important. And I think it's very good for Manatee County. It's very good for our region to have that type of clout in the Senate and the clout that you have in the House. Having said that, I think I did post a few more no votes than the gentleman to my right on a couple of issues that we didn't see eye to eye on. But if we did, if we voted the same on every issue, I don't think we would be doing our job or looking at the issues that come before us and really analyzing what we are doing. And I'm sure we'll get into a little bit of that in the Q&A. Let me back up and hit some big picture items. $500 million in tax and fee cuts. $500 million. Your Florida Chamber was with us all the way on that, on our tax package and our fee reductions. And that's significant. Those are dollars that are going back in your pockets, in the pockets of Floridians. I mean, that's a major change, and it shows a lot of responsibility as times have become better economically, that we didn't just take the money and go out and spend on anything that we could spend on, but instead looked at where we could return some of the taxes and fees that frankly were necessary in more austere times to make sure we are being responsible. Also, reserves. We dramatically increased our reserves in the state budget so that we have dollars put aside for tough situations. And I remember I was in the House when the economy began to crumble, and those reserves that we had were so necessary. I mean, if you compare Florida to other states that didn't have reserves, We are head and shoulders above because we didn't have to kill a lot of programs that you saw around the nation being killed because there just was not money there. But even with our reserves, we still went through them very quickly and went through and into some tough times where some tough decisions had to be made, and we made them, and we continued to balance our budget. And unlike Washington, we come back to you and we've spent what we have and nothing more, and we are responsible fiscally. So that's some of the big picture, budget issues that need to be recognized and need to be considered when you think about the session that we just went through. And in terms of the overall session, it's one of the best that I can remember. I've had, 12 regular sessions, 16, 18, and a lot of special sessions as well. And I feel really, really good about the work that was done and how we came back. And I have to give the governor some credit. Governor Scott has done a great job in leading and prioritizing us on some of these issues that we responded to legislatively. And I'm sure he will be supportive going forward as he reviews the budget and looks at items throughout the state, but hopefully especially in this region. From an education standpoint, over the last 2 years, and especially coming through the finish line this year, we've transformed education in the state of Florida. We have taken it from a system that was disconnected to jobs and the workforce and into a world where it's tethered together. And that includes K through 12, includes our state college system, includes our university system. I've never seen a focus like we have now on career and professional education, on science and technology, and performance in our institutions. At the university level, we put $200 million in play on performance funding. I see Casey's shaking his head. And this is to make sure that we are getting the results out of our institutions, out of our universities, as well as our colleges and our tech centers, to make sure they're doing the job that they were set up to do, so we don't have to hear about the students who are leaving and have no opportunities and coming back home. A lot of what you heard on the campaign trail the last national election. Florida's taken the lead on that. We've also increased access, and that's something I'm very proud of. Our need-based financial aid has gone up, so has our merit-based, and we've established now for the first time in the state of Florida a national merit scholarship. We didn't have that. We were not leading the nation on national merit scholars in our universities because other states had a better program. We now have that in the state of Florida. An issue that also was very important to me, in fact, I carried the bill on it, was our prepaid program. Our prepaid program became unaffordable, so it was flying in the face of its original design. The way the fees were being calculated were putting a prepaid contract into the mid-50,000s. We have now gone back and looked at the formula, based it fiscally sound on actuarial reserves, and are able to reduce those contracts significantly. And at the same time, return $50 million to Floridians, people who are engaged in those contracts right now. Workers' compensation, something that you all are interested in, that the Florida Chamber has worked with us on. I've worked with CFO Atwater to bevel some of the edges, so to speak, on stop work orders to make sure that the department is being responsive and not leaving businesses and employers who may have made a scrivener's error or a technical mistake unable to function and unable to operate while the administrative red tape is being reviewed. And so that should help people stay working and productive more than presently. There's another area that I think we really did well in this session, and one that is very dear to me, and that's with our developmentally disabled. In our education budget, we put $44 million towards eliminating the wait list for vocational rehabilitation for our most needy students. That's big. This is meaningful to families. This makes a life change for them. We also established at $18.4 million a new program in the state of Florida that we refer to as personal learning accounts, where families with special need children can now have more flexibility in the funding that comes through the education system, not just to have the academic side, but also speech therapy or other types of rehabilitation or services that will help them have a full picture and be able to be productive. In the legal system, we now have a requirement that special needs children going through the dependency process have an attorney. Up till this session, the parents were entitled to an attorney, but not the children. And when you think of child abuse, it's horrible in and of itself. But when you compound it by including a special needs child, it becomes very clear why we need to take every possible step to make sure they are being protected. And then finally, before we do questions, environmentally we did very well too. I'm very pleased that our water management district has the funding for the dispersed water program. I mean, water is an issue that's with us now and going into the future, and I was glad that we were able to focus in that area too. And those are just some of the highlights in different areas in the process, both policy and budget, that made up, again, what I consider a very positive and robust session. As the gentleman to my right have said, I enjoy very much representing Manatee County as part of the Senate District. You all are my friends. I miss you when I'm gone. Well, most of you. And so it's, again, good to be back, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, we're about to start the Q&A session. We've got about 25 minutes for that, so we've got plenty of time. The rules are in front of you generally, and again, I'd like to remind you, please do make your question in the form of a question, not just walking up and making a particular opinion or statement. We are looking for questions. Number two, we are on TV, or we will be on TV. And you will be on TV if you will make your way to the microphone over here, and you'll actually be heard if you speak into the microphone. If you stand up at your table, no one is going to hear you except the people in this room. So as we have our first question making their way to the question, I've got one quick one. I just walking through the halls in March, I wanted to know, is it true that Governor Scott threatened not to sign the refund bill unless you officially named the repealed tax the Charlie Crist tag and license tax? That's not true. He did not do that in House or Senate. Okay. All right. Do we have our first question? And again, identify yourself as Commissioner Whitmore.
Yeah, Carol Whitmore, Manatee County Commissioner. I just have a question. If somebody could help me for next year, what is the appetite with our legislator, with the leadership changes that are going to be happening regarding Medicaid? Is it going to be brought up? It was a taboo issue this year, and I'm just wondering if there's any appetite to discuss it next year. I know the governor supports it, and I was just wondering what the thoughts were from the board.
Okay. Do you have a specific panelist, or you want to let them select?
Probably Bill and Stubbe. Yeah, I think because I think Greg's doing healthcare this year, and I know Bill has in the past.
Boyd escaped that one.
Yeah.
No. You know, I haven't heard specifically from an individual senator, and I'll only speak for the Senate side, but you know, obviously we had the select committees this last 2-year cycle. We did address it in the Senate. It's an issue that has not gone away, and so I would expect that we'll continue to look at it on the Senate side. Now, whether it actually gets through and becomes law is a different story, but it's not something we're just not going to ignore.
You know, that's one of the interesting things that they're on 4-year terms in the Senate, but I think you guys changed leadership too, so a lot of the committee chairmen probably changed. In the House, we have a new speaker every 2 years, so Representative Boyd and I have no idea what committees we're going to be sitting on next year or what committees we may or may not chair. So that's one of the challenges, is not knowing where specifically the next incoming speaker is. I have not talked to Representative Krista Foley specifically on that issue. My gut is that the House won't address it. We had a pretty firm stance on Medicaid expansion in the House. It was a little different than what the Senate was. My gut tells me that we probably won't address it, but you know, with a new leadership team coming in there, depending on what Representative Krista Foley, who will be the new speaker, decides he wants to tackle, may be an issue he may want to tackle. But my gut tells me that it won't be something that the House will pick up.
Yes, sir.
Rick Catlin, Islander newspaper in Anna Maria. This is for Senator Galvano. Senator, you voted against the final version of SB 356 as it came back from the House. The vote in the Senate was 30-2. The House did not approve your amendment. Do you feel that the bill as passed will be helpful to the island communities in your district in controlling vacation rentals? Or do you still feel that your amendment, which sets a minimum, is needed? Thank you.
First of all, I think the bill will be helpful. How helpful, I'm not sure. The current law said you could not regulate a property on the basis that it was a vacation rental. And so that provision has been removed, but there is a prohibition on any type of regulation for frequency or duration. And it could be argued that under current law, you could still craft regulation and not have the nexus be that it's simply because it's a vacation rental. And when I did my town hall meetings and met with people in the community, the issue that kept coming back to me was what we were calling mini hotels, or the weekend or the one night party stays that were having an impact in a residential neighborhood that essentially disturbed the nature of that neighborhood, and in some instances disturbed the peace. And so when I worked with Chairman Thrasher, he and I talked it through, and we said, you know what, having some sort of ability for the local governments at the local level to control duration without letting it go crazy so that you kill economic development is probably a good idea. And that's where the amendment came from. That's why it was put on. When the House took it off, you know, in my opinion, it was it didn't get at the heart of the issue that we had here in Manatee County, and so it was not something I wanted to support any further.
Please identify yourself.
My name is Nick Zach. I'm with Boyd Insurance and Investment Services. On behalf of all of us, I know that be careful, Jim. On behalf of all of us, we know how hard you guys work, and thanks for all the stuff that you guys do. And contrary to what you think, Representative Boyd, we're happy you're going to be back. We haven't had a laugh in about 2 months, so we're really happy you're coming back to the office. A lot of the work that we do in the insurance and investment business is related to retirement planning and consulting. Can you guys bring us up to date on what's going on with the state of Florida pension reform?
Directed toward
Anybody that wants to take that?
You think Nick and I'd have a chance to talk about the office, but I haven't seen him probably for 5 minutes since I got back. But and thanks, I guess I know I'm good for something there, the jokes maybe. But pension, Representative Stubbe was brave enough to talk about the things that he worked on that didn't pass, and I kind of left that out. But one of the things that I worked on and worked very hard on this year, and I felt very passionate about, was pension reform, and it was a priority of the Florida Chamber, and many of the Chamber executives from around the state were on a conference call with us probably a month or so ago about it. And, last year the House had a pretty aggressive pension reform plan, and it didn't make it. This year, talking with some of our friends in the Senate, not Galvano, but another fairly influential senator, I thought we had an agreement on a plan that would be good for Florida, that would be good for taxpayers, and would be certainly good for the workers. And it was a very, very narrow approach to pension reform. And I won't go into all the details, but essentially it, over the course of, the studies showed over the course of 30 years, it would save taxpayers about $28 billion. $28 billion. That's a huge number. Right now, our pension plan is $21 billion underfunded. Everyone would argue, and I would too, that in terms of looking at pension plans across the country, ours is pretty sound. 85% funded is pretty sound. But Detroit thought they had a pretty sound program too. Lots of the municipalities across the country that you read about every day in the paper thought they had pretty sound programs. So we were trying to take an approach that protected employees, gave them choice, gave them options, but also protected taxpayers. So it gave certainty and stability to the program. We passed it through the House. It was a partisan vote, and unfortunately it was because, frankly, the unions convinced our friends on the other side of the aisle that this was a soft close and we were going to, take another stab at it next year, although I argued, I thought very, very passionately that this was a fix that we thought was good. If we did something this year that was that significant but impacting so few people in terms of changes they would have to make, it would be something that would probably last for a long time and we wouldn't be looking at it again. But nonetheless, we did pass it through the House. The Senate didn't take it up, our bill. I'm sure, I haven't talked to the senator about it, but I would guess it'd be something he would look at very carefully if it did come over there. But unfortunately, it didn't get through there. So I don't know what we'll do next year. I don't, like as Greg said a minute ago, we don't know what the speaker's priorities are going to be or plans for the next session, or for the next 2 years. But I was passionate about it because I think it really was a good program that fixed a problem, a future problem. We had one good Republican senator not too far from here that said, well, we don't have a problem, why deal with it? Well, personally, I didn't think I got elected to go up there and wait for problems to happen and then try to fix them. I think we need to be proactive, look at things that we see coming that other people have already dealt with and try to fix it. So we'll see what happens next year, but that's kind of a long way around, maybe a short answer, but thank you for asking.
All right, Commissioner?
Good morning. Betsy Benak, Manatee County Commission, and I'm going to go a little bit outside the box here and ask you a question about something that is affecting us greatly. First of all, I want to say thank you for everything that you have done for the county. We really do appreciate everything you do up there, your fiscal responsibility, and some of the things that you've brought back. The water project is wonderful. But the big issue that we're facing right now is indigent health care, as of course our fund is running out. And just a question I want to ask is whether or not there's any opportunities, and you think this has to be done at a local level, or is there any opportunities that might change the picture from a state level? I know there's been a lot of health bills. I was just listening to it on the radio, but I haven't heard whether or not there's anything that might change at the state level that we should be taking into account. So I'm going to ask you, do you think that indigent health care has to be solved totally on the local level, or is there anything that the state might do that could help us out?
Directing that to,
To everyone.
okay.
And great question. I know Manatee's struggling with that. First of all, the bulk of indigent health is solved at the state level in partnership with the federal government. I mean, that's how every year we go through, we have what we call the LIP pool, the low income pool, and we work out formulas to try to address the needs of indigent health care and people who are in need of it. And those dollars are distributed throughout the counties based on the hospitals that have the populations or the greater populations of indigents that they serve. So yes, it's constantly something we're looking at. The federal government made some changes this year that we thought was going to result in actual more dollars for the low-income pool. They really didn't. But there's that opportunity going forward. And then on a local level, we fund like Manatee Rural Health, for example, the ER diversion program we have in different parts of the budget. So it's something we'll continue to look at. The state definitely has a role, and local governments do too, obviously, and so it's something that we'll continue to work on.
Senator Galvano hit the nail on the head. I mean, we spent, I think Medicaid last year was $22 billion that we spent just on Medicaid. That's your state taxpayer dollars at work, the LIP funding, the low income pool funding. And then and I think this is a point that is important too. I mean, we pay a lot of our hospitals a lot of money. I mean, the great example is All Children's. 78% or 82% of what they do is Medicaid, and then they get individual appropriations directly from the state. We pay for trauma services. There's a lot of things that we pay for at the state level, and I think you'll see that as the economy continues to improve, I think you're going to see more and more money go to that. I know more money went to try to reimburse some of those healthcare expenses. So if you look at, and I could add it up for you and give you all the numbers, but it's billions and billions of dollars that we spend at the state level for both Medicaid, low-income pool, and a lot of different programs that we have both at the mental health area and that goes directly to other hospitals. And I think we'll continue to do that as the economy continues to improve. And I've been in healthcare committees every year I've been in the House, and I'll probably continue to play some role in that. So I hope that we can continue to help there.
JB.
Morning. JB Taylor, Folly Brain Architects. Over the last year, within the city of Bradenton, we've had 3 craft breweries open up, and I bet you can guess where this is going. How do we go from starting out with 64-ounce growlers and go to all the regulation that was lumped onto that bill? And I'm going to direct this at Representative Stubbe and Senator Galvano. That way we see both sides of the House. Thank you.
That was going to come up at some point. I actually worked, that was probably, and that was on my list of things that didn't make it through the process that I worked on. That was probably one of the things that I spent the most time on this year in the House. I vice chaired Business and Professional Regulation. We did the proposed committee bill that would have allowed the 64-ounce growlers, along with all of the other things that the craft breweries wanted. And quite frankly, the distributors, they supported it in committee, but they didn't like what we were doing because it was giving the craft brewers a lot of autonomy. And I could spend an hour talking about all of the things that happened. And basically what had occurred, I mean, this is no secret because the Senate president made a lot of these comments public in the press. The Senate president was very much favoring the distributors' position on a lot of these issues. The House, I would say, the regulations that were put in place actually put into place things that they were already doing that was questionable whether they could do or not. And I'll give you a quick example. And I'll give you a little bit of information before this because I've learned from spending the last 5 months on this, it's a very complicated issue. You have the 3-tiered system. So you have the wholesalers or the brewers, then you have the distributors, and then you have retailers. Right now, the Department of Business and Professional Regulations actually is getting vendors licensed to a lot of these craft breweries. Some people will argue that that violates 3 tiers and DBPR shouldn't even be issuing those licenses because they're brewing the beer and then they're also acting as a retailer and selling the beer. So if John Horn is in the room, he could probably talk about being a retailer in that tier. So there's argument that DBPR has the wrong opinion on that issue now. So what we were trying to do is fix that issue and say in statute that what craft brewers are currently doing under current law, they're allowed to do. And then we put all this other stuff in there that they wanted. They wanted the 64-ounce growler. They wanted a tap room. Then they wanted guest taps. So in our bill, the PCB that I carried in the House, allowed them to have guest taps of other craft brewers. So if Motorworks Brewing in Bradenton wanted to use some of Darwin's brew, they could use Darwin's brew at their location because according to them, they wanted to do that. They wanted to be able to help each of the craft breweries out. So that was in the legislation. There were so many different forms of that legislation. It's hard to kind of talk about, but that's in general what the legislation was. That passed Business and Professional Reg, and then it hit a roadblock in regulatory affairs in the House. And then they brought up a bill that would have just done the 64-ounce growlers, and then she TP'd the bill. It was Representative Artilles and Young's bill. And then what the Senate sent over was a lot more in the direction of the distributors than the House was willing to go, and that's why ultimately nothing happened. But I can guarantee you, and Senator Galvano and I co-sponsored a bill this year on the package stores. My plan for next year is to do, whether I'm in that committee or not, which again, I don't know where we're all going to land, but I want to do a full comprehensive reform as it relates to both craft brewing, the package stores issues. There's a lot of alcohol-related issues that are kind of floating around out there that have been in place since Prohibition, early after Prohibition, like 1935, that I think really needs a more free market approach of how we do it while still protecting our citizens from alcohol abuse and minors getting drugs or minors getting alcohol. So that's kind of a large approach to the issue, but I'm happy to talk to you about it offline. And I'm committed to working on those issues next year, and I think you will see something very comprehensive next year on that.
I think Representative Stubbe did a good job describing the issue. And when I saw the issue come through Reg Industries, what I identified was that the current craft breweries were operating under a 1963 really quite vague provision in the law that was designed to enable Busch Gardens as to be able to have an attraction and have beer at the same time. And so what ultimately passed the Senate floor would have gone a long way to establishing very clearly in law the opportunities for craft breweries so that they weren't subject to a potential challenge, as Representative Stubbe has said. And it would have identified what levels of product could be sold from the site itself, what could be given out in terms of promotional type of activities, and then eventually when they would have to work into the three-tier system. And so it did pass through the Senate. Unfortunately, the feedback that the sponsor was getting, Senator Stargell, and she did a great job on the bill. The feedback, when she would share it with me, it didn't make sense. I felt it was almost as if the craft brewers were saying, look, don't do anything. We've got this provision that we're operating under now, and we can pretty much do what we want. The department has been rubber stamping what we're doing, so leave us alone. But that's very short-sighted and doesn't make sense. And I'm very pleased to hear you say that about the overall beverage laws, because we do have a whole group of laws that were generated in the wake of Al Capone's arrest, so that they could, and it's serious, and so that we wouldn't have situations where you had those type of illicit organizations controlling alcohol in the United States and in particular Florida.
Mr. Horn.
Hi, my name's John Horn from the Anna Maria Oyster Bar, and I was content to sit in the back. But anyway, Greg, I will be happy to volunteer for a committee or for anything for that. It's a breath of fresh air to hear you guys say that, because every time I've asked about the three-tier system, it's like, well, that's the way it's always been. I mean, that's just the most ludicrous thing in the world. And when you read in the paper that, I think it was the Senate president, I could be wrong, said, well, that would anger my local Anheuser-Busch distributor. And it wasn't ours. God knows we all anger Saputo every day, but and vice versa. It wasn't ours, but I mean, I did talk to John, and John, when we were talking about the craft brewers, and he said, how would you like it if someone opened up a store and started competing with you? That's what's happening with these craft brewers. And I said, it happens every day. It's called the free enterprise system. So I'm happy to sit on it. I'm happy to help you, and I'm happy to get the monopoly behind us a little bit. Back to rural health and the health care. Is there a way to get sovereign immunity for some of the doctors that are working on indigent care? Is that a national or a state level? I do not know the answer to the question, but I think that's a start as well. They're asking, and you may know this, you have more, I was pre-law, and so I don't have as much as you did.
Well, you brought up some things that I want to mention real quick about the alcohol laws. This is how crazy it is. So wineries, craft distillers, and craft breweries are all treated differently under the law. So I can go out to Bunker Hill Winery out of Bunker Hill and buy as much wine as I want to buy. I can buy a case, I can buy 2 cases, produce at their location. If I go to a craft distiller, so if I go to Siesta Key Rum, which I've been to their location, was very involved in the bill we passed last year as it related to the distillers, and I can only buy 2 bottles per person per year at their place of establishment, and that was a compromise bill that we did last year. The bill that I started on last year would have said, okay, if you go down to Siesta Key Rum and you're a tourist and you want to come and see how Siesta Key Rum is made, and you go to their place of business, prior to last year, you couldn't buy any. You could just look at it, and then you'd have to go to ABC or Total Wine to buy it.
Yeah.
Now you can only get 2, which was a compromise to get something out. I mean, I think if you go to a place of business that is supporting our economy in the state of Florida using Florida products, then if you want to buy 2 cases of Siesta Key Rum, how's that a big deal? Now, I don't think they should be able to have multiple locations and act as a retailer outside of their place of business. That's a different issue.
Yeah.
But
I have to
it's
use a distributor to buy Siesta
correct.
Rum.
So you have to, everything has to go through the distributor. And then as it relates to the craft breweries, they're really operating under, I mean, they may see a lawsuit as it relates to the opinion by DPR, and it could completely shut them down. If there was a lawsuit tomorrow that said, you, DBPR, can't issue vendor's license to these craft breweries because it violates 3-tier, which it arguably does. They're a brewery, and they're acting as a retail. If you go down to their brewery and you're buying a bottle of their beer, whether it be in a can or whether it's off the tap, they are acting as John Horn as a retailer, and they're violating 3-tier. So if there was a court case that said you're no longer able to do that, they would only be able to brew beer and then send it to the distributor, and then the distributor would have to send it back to them or send it back to John Horn so he could sell Motorworks Brewery. So those are the things that I think that I would love to work on next year, and then the things that Senator Galvano and I worked on with the package stores is silly too. As far as rural health, this year we passed a dentist bill that would allow dentists and I believe dental hygienists who do free pro bono dental care sovereign immunity. So I do think, and I think there's some physician sovereign immunity if you're doing indigent care that we have in place. Right. But this year we passed for dentists, and there's the stories are great. I mean, I had some come into my office, and they opened up the stadium up at USF Tampa and had, for a whole day, people come in. They served like, I don't know, 100,000, 10,000 people in a day, and all these dentists volunteered their time. And prior to this past year, they didn't have sovereign immunity, so something happened. And this year we passed that bill, both in the House and the Senate. So there are steps to protect physicians who are offering their services either pro bono or for free to be protected in that regard.
Thank you.
Okay, in honor of NFL Draft Day, we're now entering the ESPN lightning round. We've got about 30 seconds left for a couple of final question or two.
Thank you. I'm Linda DeMello, and a resident of Manatee County. And like so many of us, we care deeply about our school system here and the challenges that it has faced and continues to face. My question is based on the fact that I don't have information, but as a citizen and county resident, I can appreciate the state's decision to hold the county responsible for the repayment of funds that were misallocated. My question is, can there be a payment plan that allows the county, the school district, to pay over time rather than absorb that cost in a single year as it tries to return to a sense of normalcy and stability? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, and our delegation has been engaged. You know, we have a good school board that we elect, and they represent the district well, and it's, you know, kind of, we don't want to step on their toes, but we've been working closely with them and trying to get some help from the state. You know, essentially, the way the state has communicated to us, we're still asking, and we've asked, the delegations asked the governor's office to look at it as well, but I'm afraid the situation is this. You know, at first it appeared, and even some reports were that it was a fine and the state was going to get the money. That's not the case. It's replenishing funds that go back into the county's school board or school district's funds, but it is a big number, and they're going to have to find that money to replenish it. The unfortunate reality is, as has been communicated to us by the Commissioner of Education in Tallahassee, Pam Stewart, is it was found in this year, or it was the penalties or the decision, excuse me, was found this year, so it has to be reinvested in those funds in the same fiscal year, which would mean by June 30th. I haven't talked to Karen, but I've talked to the current school board chairman, Ms. Aranabar, about it. I think they understand that, and it is unfortunate, but we've asked one more time, is there some leniency? Could they maybe stretch it out over 2 years? I'm an eternal optimist, but I don't believe that's going to be allowed to have happen. And I know it's a tough thing for the schools, for the school board to deal with, very tough thing, because it's a big number. And ultimately, all we really want is great education for our kids, right? So we've done everything we can. We're still trying kind of one last Hail Mary with the governor's office to see if there's any leniency or any leeway, and just a little bit, as you suggested, a little bit of a time frame to pay it. But unfortunately, I don't think there will be, but we're still holding out that little bit of hope that they might be able to work something out. And I don't know if the senator, he's in that silo, he may have a little more to.
No, you've described this situation correctly. I just wanted to point out that Congressman Buchanan's been working on this as well. I spoke to him. I know he reached out personally to Pam Stewart, the Commissioner of Education. Congressman Rooney has been engaged. So we're all engaged. And the other thing I want to make very clear is that to a person, the current school board has been recognized as doing a great job. And we've been told this is not any reflection on who you have representing our school district now. These are funds that are simply being sought to be recovered under the parameters that exist presently for this type of situation. And you know, we're going to keep trying, but we need to recognize that it's a reality, frankly.
All right, final lightning question. This really is a lightning question. The sales tax on commercial leases did not get through this year. Unfortunately, from all appearances, the refunding of tags and license and so forth was an election year, more appealing type cut. Representative Stubbe, do you plan on reintroducing legislation, same type, and pushing it on through next year?
I'll file the exact same bill I filed this year.
Okay, all right. And Senator Galvano, will y'all pass this bill? Yes, sir.
Okay. Because you know, we went way beyond election year. You know, we painstakingly, as a legislature, both chambers had a tax package that we reviewed tax by tax by tax to get to a certain number. And beyond the fees, we had $105 million in existing taxes that were cut and are no longer going to have to be paid by the citizens of Florida. The commercial lease tax was part of that package to begin with, as was many other items and issues. And so it's a question of one bite at a time on taxation and making sure that we're not moving too fast, having a fiscal balance, but it's certainly an issue that will be revisited again.
Okay, thank you. All right, in wrapping up, first of all, again, thank you, panelists. I think we all agree we're extremely fortunate as a county to have such a high caliber of representation, continuing a tradition for as long as I've been on the legislative committee. We've had some great people up here, and I'm sure long before that too. A couple of brief announcements. We have 2 breakfasts coming up. June 4th, Dr. Matthew Kranig, who is out of Washington, D.C., and floats in some very high international circles. That is at the Renaissance on 9th, and one that is so recently booked, it's not even printed out. Looks like somebody was thinking about draft day already. Also on June 6th, Mike Evans. He's the wide receiver from A&M, right? Okay. It's actually Mike Boyd, who is an international airport expert consultant, and that breakfast will be at 7:45 at the Chambers Lakewood Ranch facility. Once again, thank you, everyone. Have a great morning, and thank you for coming. Thank you.